then if there's any discussion, if anyone has any statements to make, we do it at that time. So I'm going to move that the Board of Education now renew the probationary contract of Margaret Hill for the 2017-18 school year.
Second.
Been moved and second. Any discussions or conversations on this item? Thank you.
Just stating, I'm still slightly considering the situation, but he was hired a week before school started. He was teaching a subject for the first time. To me, that is a new teacher, because that's a district he doesn't know. The subject he isn't as familiar with, that he hasn't taught frequently. I think that does play a role.
Yeah, I guess to be perfectly honest with you, sometimes you have to sort of go by gut, some of these things. And I sort of had a good feeling myself. I had good vibes from the young man. I liked his background, where he came from, the things he's done. And I understand the issues he's confronting. This whole issue of disengagement is not him only. That's an issue that we're challenged with in the district, this issue of disengaged students. And so I think it's tough for the teacher. And we know that we have some issues in the district around cell phone use. So that's an issue too. And so we also know we have teacher shortages because our teachers are so supported by the state. We know that it's hard to fill those vacancies. And in fact, we don't have a lot of vacancies for these positions. So this is a difficult one for me, to tell you the truth about it. And so I'm going to think here as you all talk and voice your opinions on this. Mr. Mertz.
On the judgment on this one, I'll be deferring to the greater knowledge and more direct knowledge of our staff that recommended it. But I do think that in addition to what Nikki brought up about him being hired the week before, teaching a subject that he hadn't taught before, I think there's also other kind of systematic factors that set him up for failures. And one of them is the extreme tracking we're doing with mathematics starting in 6th grade, and that we're clustering struggling students and students with behavioral issues in the regular class tracks. And again, this starts in 6th grade, and by the time you get to high school, it is we have essentially 2 or 3 different schools going on. We have with that, and in addition, putting a new teacher, new to the district, new to the topic, with what are probably the most difficult and perhaps the most important student classes we have, as opposed to perhaps putting them on the honors track where these struggles would not have hit there. Systematically, these are issues that I do think set them up for failure in some ways, and ones that we do have control over. So I will be deferring to the judgment of our administrators, but I worry about the systematic factors.
Is there some legal opinion you want to offer?
So I just want to highlight that the request to be heard was in closed session without a request for the personnel information to be disclosed in open session, and the employee has the opportunity to make that hearing open. Okay. So just to take into consideration our obligations under closed versus open and personnel matters.
Okay.
I think everything we had was public record.
Okay.
Yeah, well, we've had larger issue discussions around class sizes in general across the board, and to hear that so many of the math classes are at 30, and then in this particular case, when it went down to 22, which is still kind of the max that we want, things were better then, but across the board, classes at 30 are difficult for even the best teachers in some cases. So that also concerned me in this particular case.
We also
And
just
I'm
want
not
to keep in
certain I
mind
can
what's
defer yet.
noticed as the topics.
I'm sorry?
We also just want to keep in mind what's noticed as the topics of this meeting. It's not policy discussions, it's a specific purpose.
Well, this was specifically about this teacher's specific class sizes. He had so many starting out at 30, starting
Right,
out
but
new,
the issue
and
is
now
what
it-
was
then when it went
appropriate.
down to 22, which is, we said that's acceptable, he seems to be doing better.
The issue is what was appropriate for closed session, with the employee's right to have requested an open session and not making that request, and then general policy issues that weren't noticed for this portion of the meeting.
Anyone else want to comment? Mary?
I concur with TJ in terms of following our administrators. We put these folks in charge of our schools. We are holding them to the expectations of seeing our students learn. And if they make this difficult decision to recommend a non-renewal, I have to trust that they have as much interest of having the best teachers in the classroom as we do. And to take a short session and believe we're going to question their judgment on this, I think doesn't bode well for whether we trust our administrators to do their jobs, and so I will also be deferring to their recommendation.
Anyone else have a comment? Anna?
And I guess I'll comment. I'm not sure if I can make this comment or not. I do think that there are some broader system issues that I'm concerned about in this situation. I do trust the guidance from administration, but I'm troubled to hear about some of the classroom dynamics that may have not put the students and the teachers in a place to be successful at the start of the year.
Anyone else? Okay, the motion is on the table, and it has been seconded. So, all in favor of the non-renewal, say aye, please.
Aye.
Any opposition? One eye. Can I see hands for, okay, so motion carries 4-3.
I'm sorry, can I see the hands, please, James, and the names, please? Thank you.
Okay, so move adjournment.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposition? All right, motion carries 7-0.
Okay.
Yeah, I might need it.
They'll make it back. They'll make it back around.
Okay, we're
We got
going to
a
get
long night.
started. Okay. We're starting with public appearances, and we have one public speaker, and that's Chris Carusi. Chris?
Oh, we have more than one.
Okay. We have more than one, but we will start with Chris. And Chris will be followed by Vicky Veer.
Hello. In addition to being a district parent, I'm also a teen sex educator, and I am up here tonight to express my support and my gratitude for the addition of affirmative language around sexual consent in the BEP. Many students and parents are quite concerned about the current language in the BEP around sexual assault and rape because it's focused on force, threat, and coercion. Including stronger language around affirmative consent is a giant step in the right direction, and I applaud you for doing it. The statistics on sexual assault are staggering. 1 out of 6 women will be raped in her lifetime, and the sexual assaults take place when victims are generally between 12 and 34 years of age. Because the BEP is about behavior education, this change to policy is both powerful and extremely important. Teaching young people that consent means yes, and that it has to be freely given in every intimate encounter at every step along the way is critical to stopping sexual assault and addressing rape culture. The new language about consent in the BEP could be stronger if it included situations where people can't consent. For instance, you can't consent if you're intoxicated. Verbal sexual harassment is an issue in our schools, especially middle and high schools. And it's not clear to me how verbal sexual harassment is going to be dealt with under the BEP. Specifically, I'm not sure where the underlying behavior falls in the policy. That said, thank you again for including an affirmative definition of consent in the BEP, and I hope that the state of Wisconsin follows your leadership. Thank you.
Okay, Vicki, followed by Chris Gomez-Schmidt.
Hi, I'm here to talk about advanced learning. I was very pleased with the hiring of Ethan Netterstrom, I hope I'm saying his last name correctly, as the new director of advanced learning. I was very impressed with his resume before I met him, and when I had a chance to meet him in person, he also impressed me as, among other things, an excellent communicator, plain-spoken, transparent, and I think that will be really important in his new position with all the different stakeholders that he will interact with. So congratulations to the district and to Jen and others for bringing that about. The one other thing I wanted to mention as part of that, which I think Chris Gomez-Schmidt will also talk about in a minute, is to urge in the budget process that the board at least look at increasing the allocations at schools that currently have less than 0.5 FTE of advanced learning specialist, and that especially with a new director who's bringing a lot of new ideas and energy to the position, it doesn't really behoove us to, possibly be lowballing him in his first year. Hopefully by a year from now, he will have his own budget and staffing recommendations or opinions, and maybe it will be more or less or differently allocated. But just as part of helping him get off to a great start in his first year, I think that's something that I would consider. Thank you.
Thank you. And Chris?
Hi, I'm also here to talk about the budget process tonight. And as Vicki spoke to having a new advanced learning director here in the district as of April, we also have the evaluation results that came out in February and an Office of Civil Rights resolution from December, and I'm hoping that we can connect all these dots. I think one of the important things going forward as the advanced learning plan is going to be reviewed and updated. I think first look at that is in June and updated in the fall, is to get the staff to a baseline where there's a half a time position at each of the elementary and middle schools. So I'm hoping that you can find a place in the budget to make that happen. I think what we've learned over the past few years that we have seen the schools that do have a 0.5, that it really makes a difference having these staff members be part of the school staff. And that has made a difference, so I'm hoping that you can take a look. It would require an additional 2.5 FTE to get those staff, those schools up to full staffing for AL to a baseline model. Thanks for considering.
Thank you. Okay, then Chris was our last speaker, and we are going to move on to approval of the minutes. Is there a motion to approve the minutes from the Operations Work Group meeting dated March 13th and April 3rd?
So moved.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? That passes 7-0. Okay. Now, just as an introduction to this evening, we do have a packed agenda, and because it is the end of the school year, we really need to give staff specific feedback on next steps. So we might have the discussion facilitated in a little different way than we have in the past, just to make sure that we get through this in a timely manner. So we are going to start with Mike Berry and the budget. And with that, Mike, are you ready to take over?
Ready to go.
Okay.
In the interest of time, ready to go. So, beginning with the meeting last week, we have moved into the board review phase of the budget process. That means less staff presentation, more board discussion. It says wait for applause in my, in my notes. So.
I'll applaud Mike.
There you go.
Thank you. Nine slides.
That's right.
It must be a record for Mike.
Okay, here we go. So tonight, 3 things we want to focus on. Where are we positioned financially in the budget? What level of agreement do we have on the priority actions? And really what comes next in this process? So we've added this slide because we were waiting for the data to come in from the RAD team. This is the input that we received in the budget through the MMSD website, 226 responses. This, and they're really focused on compensation, health insurance, benefits, and pay, and then prioritizing staffing. This tends to be a lagging indicator, really, kind of reflects what we're putting out there often and what's in the media. Last year at this time, we had only 97 responses at this point. So obviously people are paying attention and following along and sharing their input. This is the budget development calendar, and just kind of a quick reminder of where we have been. November is when we really got going. That was the referendum to exceed revenue limits, which was supported by the community. Thank you again. November, December, and January, we previewed the priority actions. That discussion was mostly staff. Tonight, the reverse, mostly board. February, we did high-level staffing, and the governor's budget proposal came out in February. March and April were tied up with compensation, health insurance especially, and the final actions that we put in the budget. And then obviously we're into May, June now for board deliberation.
And just as a reminder on calendar, normally we start the process in January. We started it in October, November to get early input from the board, and specifically on those priority actions.
Great. As to financial position, if essentially it's this. Our general fund expenditures in this proposal are $364.5 million, and we are assuming $125 per pupil of state support. And we strongly recommend that we hold at that position at least through June adoption of a preliminary budget. Sure, if you could draw a line through the second and third column, between those 2 columns, that's really where we are. It's possible that aid might increase to $200. We also don't know about equalization aid. There's a lot of variables as you move into that 3rd column to the left. So we're recommending that we hold in terms of total expenditures. That is not meant in any way to inhibit the board from discussing priorities, swapping priorities, adding priorities. But it does mean that we have to reallocate within the overall budget once we get up to $364.5 million. And that's our little preview. With that, I'm going to pause here for, I think, a little discussion of how we're going to proceed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Jen, did you have a few words?
Yeah, thank you, Mary. What we are thinking based on our planning with Mary is that we would pause here and get a chance for the board to share with us their perspective, specifically on the priority actions, where you may have concerns or lack or not support a particular priority action, where you might want some additional information, and where you may see something that's missing. Before we have that conversation, I want Lisa to be able to preview one last time some thinking on the priority actions, which includes where we have a request for early approval in May and why, as well as some additional thinking about adjustments we'd like to make before the budget is finalized.
Okay, so this is a fairly dense slide that has all of our priority actions on it that we've been discussing since November. And I just wanted to remind the board that there are 3 buckets of priority actions that we've discussed. The first is foundational, those actions which build our base of best practice and work that really solidify the work that we're doing, work that we believe will get us strong outcomes for our students. The second bucket is our accelerated priority actions, those that build on past successes, go deeper, and really for the purpose of going faster to get results quicker. And if you remember, those were actions that were packaged around strategies for teachers, for families, and community members. And then finally, our innovative bucket, actions that might be new or not yet implemented. Some might involve a needs assessment, but all are one-time sources of funding for district work. And just as a reminder, all of those actions can be found in your budget book on pages 24 to 36, if you have that readily available like Mike and I always do lately. So I'm not going to go through these line by line because we've talked about them, but I am going to do some highlights around that right-hand column around request for early approval. So there are some places in the far right column that indicate an early approval request, and these are really the areas that involve FTE personnel. And the rationale behind this is that we really can stay ahead of the labor market, that we can do our best to diversify and get high-quality staff into these positions. So that's, you'll see that on the far right-hand side, and it includes positions including the Director of Early Learning, OMGE teacher leaders, staff at the school-based level around AVID, and some of our ACP and experiential learning positions. So you'll see that is primarily really FTE that we wanted to talk to you tonight about early approval. Finally, before we stop and open up for discussion, we have had a couple conversations recently about some emerging thinking in some other areas. First of all, thanks to Vicki and Chris. We also think Ethan's pretty awesome. I had a meeting with him today. And now that he's been hired and he's meeting with every principal in every single school. And he has done thinking about a more consistent approach to staffing across the schools. And he and I just discussed today the potential add of 2.5 FTE, which would indeed bring that stable level to all the schools in terms of staffing. And it would also provide the really needed point person at high schools around secondary support. Also, you'll hear later tonight that some specific BEP-related changes we may talk about later tonight related to some very intentional work around professional development, around perhaps an increased number of seats in alternative programs, and then also some very specific support around getting schools to set up a system for in-school suspension and intervention that is more targeted. So that'll come up in the presentation after this. But I'll pause there, so I wanted to sort of provide you with 3 buckets. This is the whole list, some early approvals, and then 2 additional areas of funding.
Lisa, can you just confirm that the last items that you mentioned about potential changes with regards to behavior, are those they're in addition to the lists that we see? Because
Correct.
those have been
Correct.
later.
Yep, those are our
in
most
response.
recent. Yes,
Okay,
thank you.
so those aren't there. Now, just reviewing again with regards to why we're taking up the subject particularly of these early approvals, is that would happen at the May board meeting, and so this will be the last discussion prior to the administration wanting early approvals on those. So in order to try to get a sense for where we want to target our discussion with nearly, I think we have about 38 different items, is what I'm going to do is go around the table, and just with regards to the early approval items, so that we focus on those, is to ask each board member if you have any clear ideas about which, for each one of those, I think we have about 8 of them, where those fall in terms of your recommendations. Then, if we have ones that are fairly clearly have significant board support, those we might need to spend less time on than those that perhaps we don't have clear ideas and really would like to have more discussion around those. And those which board members don't have any interest or little interest. So, James, do you mind kicking that off? I think the first one we have there is the Director of Early Learning.
So you're asking if whether or not your idea as to my support or not?
Well, I'd say the 3 buckets. Like, is it generally supportive, generally not supportive, or just really want to have more information? And that helps us to narrow down where we focus our discussions tonight. Jim?
Mary, can I make a process suggestion?
Sure.
I know that we've got a whole other topic after this, and we want to surface as much as possible. I appreciate wanting to start with the early approvals first and surface any issues there, rather than go line by line.
Yeah.
Can we potentially just go around and hear if anybody has any concerns about any of the early approvals?
That sounds great.
Okay.
James, do you have any concerns about the early approvals?
Well, I mean, I have expressed to the board and administration before where my priorities lie moving forward. And those are largely in the area of behavior, things we can do to improve our class in schools, and sort of work around the BEP. I'd like to see us bring to a conclusion the ongoing discussion around class size. And so those are my 2 biggies for this budget. And so as I look through these items, that's where my priorities lie. So if I see priorities here that just does not align to those, they're not my high priority. And also, I really want to take a look at as we add positions. When we have positions that we are, our staff is already at 83% of our budget. So I want to make sure that I'm comfortable with adding positions,
Sure.
correct positions. And so those are sort of the 3 areas that I'm focusing on as we move forward.
And that feedback works really well for us, Mary. I mean, it doesn't have to necessarily be on the early approvals, but whatever's on your mind in terms of things you don't support, or would like to see that aren't there, would just love to know whatever's on the board's mind.
Okay, well, we're going to proceed on just each person giving that type of info, or specifically on the early approvals, because we're going to have to need to discuss, I think, all the early approvals, unless there is some consensus that says, yes, we feel comfortable with that. Anna?
Sure. I had a question in regard to, I see a Director of Early Learning, but there are 2 other positions that I feel like we're adding. We're adding a Director of Special Education, and then we also have a Director of Innovative, Alternative, something or others. I'm just wondering where they're falling.
I don't know what the Director of Innovative Alternative something or others is.
Director,
Yeah. You mean my special assistant position, Rodney's old job?
Yes, yeah.
So I can speak to that. The special assistant position has been a position since I started. I did not fill the position this year. And because I wanted to think about what I might want to do differently with that position. I plan on filling it. It's not a new ask. It's not a new position. It is the special assistant position that's been around for a while. The job description has been updated to include taking off of Kelly Rupel's plate, our chief of staff, some duties that she took on for us. Thank you very much, Kelly, which included all of the renewal process, et cetera, for charters. So that is one particular aspect of the position, but it continues to be focused on taking on special projects on behalf of me, on behalf of the superintendent, with a focus on equity and innovation. Which is all about trying to accelerate outcomes for the students in our district that are underperforming. So that position, happy to talk about, but it is not a new position to the district. The position for special ed is something that we have established this year through repurposing funding, and I'll let Lisa talk about that.
Right, so the Director of Special Education is a new position in the Student Services Department, and that position was actually created due to a retirement in that department of an administrator.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so your question, Anna, I want to make sure that we're answering it. So that's just a little information about those two positions. You're asking about as it relates to the Director of Early Learning. Is that right?
Well, I just see these additional FTE, and I just knew from looking at the remodel or
Yeah, the
whatever you did
reorg.
with staffing, the reorganization,
Uh-huh.
that there are other positions. So I was trying to figure out where those positions came into this. But, so you're talking about the assistant director, that retirement led to the opening of the.
Correct. That allowed us to create the Director of Special Education. The Director of Early Learning is actually
is a
the
new
only new
position.
administrative position that is an early approval, and that position will sit squarely in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction to really focus on 4K, early childhood and 4K supports, and really creating a vision and really deeper understanding of early childhood education.
That's right.
So actually, I think, let's stay with that,
Yeah.
Lisa, since, TJ, Director of Early Learning,
Yeah, I guess,
Yeah.
you know, if we can stay with Director of Early Learning, currently we have a coordinator of early and extended learning, and so, what will be redefined? Will that position continue? Will we have a director and a coordinator? How will that work?
So actually, there is no longer a Director of Early and
There's a
Extended Learning.
coordinator
There is a
listed in our,
There is a coordinator of 4K, and there is a coordinator of summer school. The new ask is a Director of Early Learning that will stay aligned with the 4K piece. The reason that we pulled those work streams apart was because it was really an undoable position when they were all together. It was very complex. So we decided to make the new Director of Early Learning, that's an ask, a fresh ask, but we pulled apart the coordinator of 4K and the coordinator of summer school to focus on those two work streams right now. So the early learning piece actually will encompass more than just 4-year-old kindergarten. That actually is about paying greater attention to the quality and programming in our community 4K sites. It's also about outreach to parent organizations and some of our early childhood centers in the city. Our coordinator of 4K right now is doing a good deal of the technical operational work. But there are some other really visionary pieces and quality pieces around the work of 4K and early childhood that we have not even been able to touch. Does that answer your question,
kind of,
TJ?
we've had conversations, and I think that we do need to get a better handle and do program improvement and quality
Yeah.
improvement around our 4K in particular and on our early childhood and early learning
Yeah.
in general. So in that sense, I'm inclined to support this position. Adding administrative positions is always something that is difficult.
Yep.
So there's kind of two other pieces. One is that if I hear you correctly, and this sounds much worse than it is, that we used to have one position, coordinator of early and extended. Now we have three, a director and two coordinators.
So we'll have a coordinator of 4K, and we have a separate coordinator of summer school.
And a director of early.
And we'll have a director of early learning to focus on that birth through really 5K lens. Right now, all we did was sort of the technical aspects, the rote day-to-day operations of 4K. We did not look at, really, we have nobody really monitoring and partnering with our 50, however many community sites we have, there's just been such a gap in that area that a coordinator just couldn't take that all on. We know that we need sort of someone who's a program manager and also someone who can set the vision moving forward. So
And then the second question is that we do have an evaluation or something that is in the innovative priorities. I lose
Sure
track
is.
of where things are.
It is, yep.
And I'm always a little hesitant that when we are spending money to learn how to do something better after bringing in someone new, as opposed to when you do, if this is a new program design and we've already brought someone in new, do you see what I'm saying? Is which is the cart and which is the horse? Is the question on that, and if you could.
I would see our director of early learning really helping to design what that evaluation might look like, or more of a needs assessment, what it might look like, working with our long-range facilities folks around where are our 4K sites, are they in the right places, where do we need to have more seats. I actually just met with the head of an early childhood coalition in the city today, and she said there are waiting lists. So we need to just do a better study of sort of where 4Kers are, what they need, what's the balance of 4K sites and community sites. So I would see that a director of early learning would actually inform what that evaluation was, so that that person had some questions that they wanted that to answer, if that makes sense.
Okay, others in terms of this director of early learning?
I'm pretty excited about investing more deeply in kind of that birth to 5 and birth to 8, if you will, kind of timeframe. So I'm very supportive of this, and I can talk. I mean, I think I more broadly have a very similar perspective, maybe to how James is thinking about this. I kind of took a look at the priority actions more broadly and tried to think, okay, we've got our base budget, that should be delivering a majority of kind of our strategic plan, strategic framework, our base operations. And so for me, the priority actions, and just to kind of throw this out there and then you can re-steer us, I've been thinking about, okay, where are the gaps, right? So what's changed that we feel like we need to do differently based on anything we've learned over the last couple of years within the district? What's changed outside of the district, or how our city is changing? And maybe, how do we want to invest for the future? So this feels like an invest for the future kind of position, and there I have other comments on the others, but using that same frame of kind of where are the gaps that I feel really strongly about right now, and that I think our community does, and a little bit on how our work has changed. So.
Okay, so, yeah, Nikki.
I would agree with Kate, and this is from my own disability lens. Average age of a white child diagnosed with autism is 18 months. The average age for a black or a Hispanic child is 5 years. That's a huge disparity. I think if we focus on early childhood, you focus on early learning, we can catch that a heck of a lot sooner than we're going to catch that if we wait until kindergarten, because we're waiting too long.
Dean?
Yeah, I got.
Just on the director of early learning before we.
Oh, no.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that?
No.
Positive, in
I support it.
favor?
Yeah, I think from different perspectives, Nikki's just raised, I think, a significant issue here. So I think we're moving in the right direction on that.
Okay, so I think I'm hearing that in general, there's support for adding this position. Is that, would that be accurate? Yeah, okay, good.
well, wait a minute.
We were almost there.
When we add a position now, that means we aren't able to add that dollar amount later. And so my question is, can't we just, I hear some board members saying they're in favor of it, but does that mean that we should be talking about actually adding this position? Because I'm wondering about the crowding out effect. We get down later on in this whole conversation, and there are things that maybe we haven't discussed that well, And we've already committed all these funds with all these positions. And so there's always something that comes up later in the process. And so, I'm all for talking about supporting, but are we talking about committing funds at this time?
Yeah, it'll
Yeah.
be May.
Yeah, typically, it's interesting. We just haven't been in this situation in a while.
And that situation is,
Having the money to actually add a position. And that is true for school-based staffing, right, with all the unallocated that we've added. That's also with some of the central office staffing. We have 4 years ago, that first year and maybe the second in May, we always did a small set of early approvals to make sure that we could get the best and the brightest into those positions. The last 2 years, we just haven't had that luxury. We've been cutting positions by dozens, both at central office and at schools. So I just want to kind of recalibrate us. This is the way that we used to operate when we weren't in severe budget cutting mode. In May, we've brought a small set of early approvals to the board. And some of this is because of those cuts, right? We cut OMGE, as an example, pretty severely over the last 3 years. And we're trying to get the office back to a place where it can actually function and follow through on the supports that we've promised our community. So I guess I say that all because I want to just sort of reset us a little bit in terms of what typically has happened in May. I think that a couple of things. One is if the board chooses not to approve all or some subset of those early approvals on the list, James, it just means that we potentially risk not getting the best candidate for those positions, right? I mean, you may end up approving it in June. We just can't extend any offers or hire anybody until after that approval at the end of June. So I think that's just it, weighing the pros and cons of locking yourselves in a little bit more versus not. What amount of money, Mike, are we talking about with the subset of early approvals? Kind of all in. What are we asking the board to lock in? Do you guys have any sense?
Oh, geez, I
We could easily add it up, but that's really.
I mean, that amount,
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't alleviate the fact that whatever you spend on X, you can't spend on Y. So that's all I'm
Right,
saying.
so-
Sure.
So it doesn't matter what it matters what the
Yeah.
amount is, but that's my point.
Right.
So,
And none
So-
of them are new proposals, yeah.
So we were thinking that in this meeting tonight, if trying to imagine sort of where the board might be, it seems like it makes sense that you'd ask, where's the flexibility in this budget if we want to do something else or something additional? I think that's really what the point we've arrived at. And then I'm saying 364.5 million is the ceiling, right? So where does that leave us? And here's where I think it leaves us, just in using my best professional judgment. We have $600,000 worth of priority action reserves that are really pulled back from a family engagement strategy from about a month ago. We figured that would be the first probably area that would be the first source of funds that would be available. And then we're thinking, all right, so that's 600,000. And I wanted to get to $1 million, and we're saying, so reallocation. So probably reallocation on the operational side of the budget. We've got some work we can do there as well. So we're trying to get to about $1 million worth of possible, flexibility for the board without going beyond that spending target. That's all within that target. So there's about $1 million of flexibility as we stand here tonight. Right? Is that fair?
Question?
Okay.
Yeah, TJ.
Jen, you talked about early approvals and hires, and I guess that there's the Director of Early Learning position, which would be an early hire. There's the OMG teacher mentors, which would be early hires. Are the Forward Madison mentors early, are those also early hire positions, or is that something different, I guess is my question.
Everything that says yes in this column means that we would be able to go forward with an early hire. I mean,
Except for
these
the ESL redesign and the PD, and the attendance at IEPs for SEAs. Those would not be early hires, would they?
Where is that? Is that? in
Those are in the
column?
yes column. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong column. I'm in the wrong column.
Okay, I think everything that's in the early approval
Okay.
column is a position that would need to be filled.
Mhm.
That's why they're early approvals. It all comes back to finding great teachers for new roles. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean it can't happen, it just means we run a risk of having to pass up some chances.
Frankly, approval at the May meeting isn't all that early in terms of the overall labor market. So,
Right, otherwise you're talking about.
July.
Right,
Yeah.
July,
Effectively.
and who's going to be waiting around for,
And the AP expansion is,
That's not an
oh, I'm
early
sorry, that's
approval.
Abbott. AP expansion has a yes in the
That
column.
actually, yeah.
okay, so let's see if we can, with early learning, so this is, the reason we're talking about these are because they are positions of hiring folks, and May approval puts us in a better position for hiring quality people than a June approval would. And so it's up to the board to decide. If you decide, no, we're not sure, and we want to have the whole budget process locked down and know what all of our different spending priorities are and where we're going to allocate funds, we can do that. It just won't be, we won't necessarily have the same pool of people you'll be choosing from. So it's up to us. So let's see if we can get, have some consensus around whether we think we want to do any of these early or not. And then, so we're going to move through them and just, until James, you had said you were going to consider perhaps all of the things and that the Director of Early Learning might not be a priority, early priority for you.
I guess I'd like to just withhold my judgment
Okay.
on that.
So I think, Jen, you've seen, I think that there may be a majority of the board that supports that, and we'll see when you bring it to a vote. And
Yeah, are there, okay, go ahead, I'm sorry.
yeah, I don't think, I mean, one
Yeah.
thing, Jen, is we're not going to, like, vote, right,
Right.
tonight?
No,
So,
no, it's just a discussion,
so
it's just
this is-
surfacing
so-
issues.
exactly.
Yeah, that's right.
So for me, it might be helpful, and I know you guys have had a lot of conversations about the budget already, but I think somewhat similar to James, it's a lot of the line items here is 38 things, right? Don't kind of necessarily rise to the top of my list. If I just think about kind of the couple of things that.
So that's why I think we're just going to go through the early approval ones, okay? And try to get as much information and as many of your questions answered on those, so you do feel comfortable, or one way or the other. Yeah, Dave?
So do you just want to start at the top and go down?
We're going to do just the ones that have a yes
Yeah,
in
so
the
the
last column. Yeah.
Just- they'll
mhm.
just start at the top, okay.
Yeah, so
'Cause I
do,
got some for one, like, I think the last one.
okay, so let's move through these. The OMGE teacher leaders for K-12 ESL support. So that says, new OMG teacher leaders will coordinate ESL redesign, professional development, and support for growing implementation of DLI classrooms K-12. Is that an accurate description? Lisa, do you want to say anything more about that?
Just that those two FTE will be funded from Title I. Title I appropriate staff members that would be working with Title I schools to support bilingual and monolingual classrooms. And, yeah, part of the ongoing support for the increasing numbers of ELLs that we have in the district.
Questions? Yeah, Dean?
Yeah, just some technical stuff. 2 teachers at 194, and then down in 18, 5 at 430. Why the discrepancy? 5 times I mean, they're not the same. If 5 teachers were at the same 194 for 2, it'd be much more. So these 5 ACP experiential learning, are they different? Why are they at different wage scales?
So for any vacancy, we try to anticipate what the labor market's going to look like and whether that would be potentially kind of a rookie entry-level position, whether it would be 5 years in, mid-career, whether it's 10-month, for a regular teacher position, or whether it's 12-month. And based on all those factors, we assign an appropriate annual salary. So you will see some variation depending on the situation.
And that figure does include benefits, right? It's not just simply
That's correct.
salary.
Well,
That's
Can I
correct.
jump ahead for just one real specific question? Then if you go down to number 2 under accelerated, a .4 position is going to be worth $250,000. I want that job.
No.
That's not right, is it?
Which one?
It includes other things.
That's part of
That's part
the
of,
250.
Yeah.
right, the staffing piece. A good question, Dean. The staffing piece is .4, that's the FTE. The overall strategy on 9th grade is $250,000. Yes, I would want that job as well. We could job share, Dean. 2/10 apiece, 1 day a
Okay,
week.
so I'm assuming that there's more to it.
Yes, certainly,
Just what I
yep.
thought, but
Yeah.
we should say that
Staffing
out
is a
loud.
Yeah.
s-
Thanks
staffing.
for calling that out,
Okay,
yeah.
And say it out loud for me too.
Just piggyback, but why do we present it that way? Aren't we doing the others per FTE?
So for each of these priority actions, we tried to list both the FTE and the total cost. We're condensing here to try to make it simple and fit on a page. You really have to go back to the book to get the full description. And
So when we get to that one, I think people will have questions about
Sure.
whether we are in fact giving indications for the whole 250 or whether we're basically
Right.
giving an indication around just the amount tied to the .4. But then back to the OMGE teacher leaders from Title I funding. Questions, comments? Yeah, teacher.
In general, I'd like to look at the Title I reserve budget or the Title I district-wide budget more generally. Some of these things, questions around that. It's also not 100% clear which schools these positions would be supporting. Is it only the DLI schools? Are they supporting other schools?
So why don't we stand?
And some of
see
these
whether
questions I've
these-
already submitted, but and then I'll comment and then wait for answers. Is that at this time I'm inclined not to add non-classroom positions.
Lisa, do you want to comment on that?
Sure. The OMGE teacher leader positions, the purpose of those hires is to provide support for our most intensive needs schools. And it's in both bilingual and monolingual classrooms. Our schools have been asking for more support. We know that the cut scores on the access test this year actually are changing, so we have more students that will continue to qualify for ESL support based on that change in scores. And these teacher leaders are actually, while they are Doyle-based allocation, they are housed in schools to support the work in developing systems to support ELLs.
Maybe just to add on there, I kind of threw this whole budget, just if we think about the way our city is changing and the way our schools are changing. ELL is the single population, our Latino population is the single population that's consistently showing strong growth. Of kind of any way you want to slice and dice our student demographics. And so I don't know if these are the right positions to support our ELL and Latino families, but I think that it is a priority for us to use some of our priority actions to support that community incrementally to where we might have thought we needed to 2 years ago. So I don't know what exactly that means for this line item, but just as I got familiar with our district, that was, I think, a takeaway for me, knowing that also we not had the ability to incrementally invest there over the last several years.
Any other thoughts on this, either positively or negatively? More questions? Okay. I don't think we've necessarily given any clear direction there, but we are on to the Avid expansion. La Follette and East Building Base, FTE total .53 for $40,000. Dean?
Yeah, is that one position?
It's actually, it's broken down, La Follette, it's .33, and East, it's .2.
Yeah,
And those allocations were decided on based on the 8th grade class that's coming in that had Avid in middle school and would need continued access to Avid in high school.
Would these be extended on to someone who's already working there? Or
Could
are we
be.
actually going to find someone for .2?
Most likely, it is to bring someone to a full-time position or make someone whole that might be part-time in a couple
Uh-huh.
positions.
Why would that be, why couldn't we do that in June? If the person's already there, how are we gonna, you're really gonna anticipate early hire will be, for this position, if it's a .2, will be important to have now? It's just, if more than likely, we're just gonna expand someone who's already there?
In some cases, it could stabilize. Principals do have sort of bits and pieces sometime that they can reassign, and it could certainly stabilize their staffing plan moving forward. Or we could wait and we could figure out, how to add those pieces. Ideally, it'd be better to stabilize the staffing plan
Yeah.
earlier.
So
rather
my
than
support the
understanding is
expansion.
that they're already at both of those schools are already at 3 sections in freshman and I think sophomore as well. So I'm not quite sure why the incoming 8th grade incoming 9th grades would prompt additional staff.
Actually, I have additional information to share with you on this with more detail about numbers from Langston, and we can get that to you. It was also about class size. We wanted to keep class sizes in Avid at 25 and not go any higher than that, so have that to provide to you also, Mary, to support the rationale.
TJ? Yeah.
Interesting to hear the Avid class size at 25 when we have math classes that are at 30, and that math class is serving our most struggling students. But setting that aside, one of the things that last year we added at Memorial, we added point something at Memorial and point something at West, I think. And I have a feeling that, there's a certain point where, to make them even with La Follette and East, and now La Follette and East have to be made even, that this seems like it's becoming an annual thing, and maybe it'll stabilize, but I guess I'll be looking for it to stabilize as a request. That's
Any other questions or comments? It sounds like people do want more information
Yep,
around.
we can provide that.
this. Clear? Yep, okay. Yeah. Oh, and the next one, okay.
The expansion for high schools, is that all, AP high schools, is that all high schools, one high school?
Yeah. Nikki, it's all of our high schools. If you remember, we began with Memorial this past year as a pilot. The folks that we're working with to utilize a data portal and actually reach out to students, it's one of our action items in our OCR resolution. And we know that those folks, actually, we met with the high school principals a couple weeks ago, and there actually is an impact we can have right now on students entering advanced coursework for next year. So we'd like to be able to get that started and give the other principals access to the portal and the data sooner rather than later.
TJ?
This feels more like a required allowance given the OCR resolution than a priority action, just a comment. That's, just, when I read it, I was like, we kind of don't have much choice here, and not that the work, the work's bad, but it feels more like, it feels more like a required allowance.
Yeah, I hear you.
And therefore, since we should support required things,
I hear
would
you.
support this.
Lisa, I was interested in what the results from doing this at Memorial have
Yeah.
shown?
Yeah.
And why we want to?
So, actually, Alex and I and Cindy were meeting with the high school principals last week. We've been meeting with Jay over at Memorial since the week before spring break, and really dug into his data, dug into the student portal, and dug into the data from the student surveys. And since we met with them over spring break, so they have already had kids scheduled between before spring break and now, they have enrolled an additional 80 students of color in AP courses. We are actually thrilled about that. The staff have really taken an ownership around this and have been, talking to kids about coursework and advanced placement coursework. And we know that now the next step, Mary, is making sure those kids have support that they need in that class. It's not just about getting them in, but it's also about support. So Memorial is actually feeling really good about it and ready to take the next steps in developing those teachers. But it's about 80 students more as a result of this work.
And
Is that
Go
80
ahead.
enrollments or 80 students?
80 students, yeah.
And can you say why this is this one time? I know the source is a one time from TID 25, but is this
Right.
1 year and it's set up and then we're good?
The idea with this work that we're doing is that the Equal Opportunity Schools creates a data portal and creates actually student profiles based on a survey that all students take. And students indicate reasons why they might be interested in advanced coursework, who are their trusted adults in school, what their grade point average is, sort of what their assets are. It's actually a really interesting student by student look at what they might be thinking and what they might be fearful of to take a class. And it provides schools with really a baseline set of data upon which to make decisions on how to reach out. The goal of this, though, is eventually for schools to take this on their own and have it sort of, I guess, bleed over in a sense to getting more kids of color to enroll in honors courses or maybe an honors course before an AP. It's about setting up the structures and the mindset around students in advanced coursework. It doesn't have to just be AP. It can also be advanced coursework or honors, but it's really about, for 1 year, sort of getting a set system around how to get your counseling practices in place, get your how and when teachers talk to kids before and during the scheduling process, and then the expectation then is that schools own it. This provides 1 year's worth of tools, and then Alex and I will really be working with schools to own this moving forward after 1
And
year.
how does it coordinate with AVID?
How does it coordinate with that? Well, it actually,
I mean, one of the goals of AVID is that students take at least one AP in honors and hopefully more. So
Yeah.
I'm wondering how that coordinates.
Yeah. So, we've talked a lot about cohort models of AVID students also enrolling in an AP class. What it does is it pulls all the data together, and you can see how many students in AVID actually enroll in AP. The AVID strategies are very much strategies that we also want to see employed in an AP class or an honors class or an advanced class. So there is a direct overlap in terms of the types of support that kids are getting in AVID or through AVID could also be delivered in an AP or an honors class.
Okay. And why is this an early approval?
We got a late start last year with Memorial. We started with them sort of late in the summer. We didn't get the data portal set up. We didn't get the student cards set up right away. And as you know, high school students start to think about their schedules. November, December, course books come out. And we were a bit behind the 8 ball with Memorial. We had to really push in these last couple of months. We can get Equal Opportunity Schools in right now with a data sharing agreement and get La Follette, East, and West on board right now with current data to figure out which students we should be getting to enroll, like where those gaps are, and we can actually be still reaching out to those students now to enroll for next year, rather than waiting until the fall.
Okay. Any other questions on that? Okay. The next item is 2.0 PST, building-based FTE. Do you want to say some? Yeah.
For acronyms, what exactly is a PST?
Program support teacher.
Sorry, I'm not.
No, Nikki, good question.
That's a great question. It's program support teachers, so special education supplemental staff, program support teachers. When we wrote and had approved the special education plan last year, these two PSTs were indicated as a next step in the plan to bring at least a half-time PST in every building to support special education programming and needs across the district. So it was really about following through on what we had wanted to do in the special ed plan.
Okay, questions? Are people generally supportive?
I'm very supportive of that. I think we want full inclusion. To have as least restrictive and have fewer kids in the special ed room and actually in the classrooms. We need as many aides and part-time service providers as we can get.
Others? Anna?
Well, yeah, and I remember discussing the 2.0 PST, which I support. Although, one thing I just want to make a comment on is that when we're talking about building level staff, I think it's very difficult to make the generalization and say each school should have X, or each teacher or each CC teacher should have 10 people on their caseload. I mean, it really works in conflict with IDEA because you're really talking about individuals. So I'm fine with this position, but one thing I'm not seeing in any of these action areas that I do have a concern with is really the number of students that are on case managers' loads, and then also too going back to how in the schools we're going over that recommended, I believe it was 30% of clustered, and I think we heard today that that was exceeded, and so I would like to know how we're addressing that, because that was piece of the special education plan.
Right.
Anna, would you do these two positions in lieu of those things that you just spoke about, or I guess I'm trying to understand your kind of, and maybe you don't know,
You could do that as well, or you could do both, I suppose.
So Anna, just to get to your question or comment about caseload sizes, I actually agree with you that in some instances that the number associated per caseload is not an accurate really representation of some of the services that students need. Some of our students require a lot more support than others, and it's one of the reasons that we want to take a look at the allocation and really assignment process of special education, how we assign resources to schools. It's one of the that was actually one of the action items. And how do you design sort of a school-based system of support versus this person has 10, this person has 10, this person has 15. I do know to your point about how are we going to monitor that density. So the special education department does have a monitoring tool that they will put in place now and start to look at periodically now that the numbers have been rolled up into next year, to see once students are enrolled and placed in classrooms, what the density is, and do some double checking and have some site-based meetings when we do hit those trigger levels that we identified in the special ed plan.
Yeah, I just wanted to remind the board that those thresholds that we set are going into place for next school year. You approved it after the beginning of this current school year, so just a reminder.
And something to think about with the thresholds that came up as well is that you're really looking at too whether you're going to be clustering kids with IEPs along with kids with 504 plans. So you might also want to be tracking that, because then it can have a doubling down effect.
Yeah, Dean.
Yeah, I guess similarly to questions I've asked around staffing in these high critical need areas is it enough? I know you put some thought into this and you think two is enough, and I'll say, I'll ask you, are you certain? And if you're not, I'm okay with a higher, these are critical need areas, and is 2 what we really need?
We talked about this a lot. We actually do feel that that's adequate. We monitor the number of students with IEPs. We monitor as that number goes up and down. PSTs, program support teachers, also have specific roles, And they, I don't know if we've ever talked about this, but one of their specific roles is to do initial IEPs. So we always look and project how many initial IEPs are coming forth, because we don't have our building-based people do all the evaluation and assessment for that. So John and his team have done some tracking about what the prediction is and what the projection is, and feel that at this point 2 is an adequate number.
Well, I'm asking this because particularly in the conversation we're going to have after this agenda item is over with, we have a disproportionate amount of kids with IEP getting BEP referrals.
Yeah.
And that link of these staff working together with BEP and everything else that they have to do, is there enough staff time to do with all the other IEP implementation? If there's behavioral referrals too, it takes time. So if your caseload is even small, if you have a high flyer that's getting referred a lot, that person's gonna take up a lot more time than you would think it would. So I just always wonder if there's enough staff to cover adequately.
So Dean, I think those are the questions that'll come when we consider the overall budget. And that's something that could be brought up at that time. So what I'm hearing is there's general support for those 2 additions. Next item is pathways, and that's 5.0, although it's broken down an addition of a 0.8 FTE on a Pathways Learning Coordinator, a 0.8 on Experiential Learning Liaison, and 3.4 FTE for ACP coordinators. Questions, comments? DJ?
Are those 0.8 Doyle-based or 0.2 at each of the high schools?
At each high school.
So it's 0.2 at each of the high schools.
Yeah, this line, all 5 are all school-based FTE.
And then the same also with the lead counselor, which is the next item or the item after that. Is that a Doyle-based or school-based?
That's actually Doyle-based, because our current counselor is only part-time, and we want to bring that person up to full-time to be parallel with the other folks on the team.
So what we're doing is we're either pulling people away from currently their 30% pathways and 60% instructional coach, or just as an example. And we're pulling them all into, like with these 0.2 here and 0.4 here, putting them as 100% maybe not 100%, but getting to 80 or something like that. That's kind of the design behind these choices here. Is that, is that a fair characterization?
It is. There is some local context to be had in terms of people and what their part-time status is, but it would be, 0.2 could be a supplement to someone who is currently 0.8, or it could be a supplement to someone who is 0.3 and it brings them up to 0.5, so, yeah.
Lisa, overall, what is the allocation within the 4 high schools for pathways, people in total, if this was approved?
I could get you that information, Mary, in total. I wouldn't want to be inaccurate right now, but the plan was to add incrementally as pathways were rolled out, and I do know that this plan exactly follows the budget document from last year into this year, but we can get you the total FTE.
Yeah, that would be helpful, particularly since the timeline for implementation has also changed.
It does bring Pathways Learning Coordinators up to full-time in each building.
Okay. Any other questions on that? Okay, then moving on. We have bringing the lead counselor to 1.0, which is 0.33, and that's 30,000. And let's see. Lisa, can you tell us a bit more about that? I'm not finding
Right,
it.
you bet. So that is actually our current person that we have supporting our school-based counselors is only part-time, and this 0.3 FTE will create a full-time position to support school-based counselors out in the field.
Questions on that?
Is that a teacher unit contract or a NUP contract?
I believe.
Or an administrative contract.
No, it's not an administrative contract, but because this person also is going to have a really big role in the summer, I believe it's going to be a NUP contract because we need them to work more than just the school year.
And the acronyms, we've got to stop ourselves.
Non-union
Non-union professional.
Thank
is-
you.
is
Sorry,
what it is.
Nikki.
No,
Just tug on your ear if you
it is a
need me to-
bad
yeah.
habit we get into, and
Yeah, thank you.
and it's good that we're being reminded of it.
Yep.
So non-union
Yeah.
professional.
You.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So then on to the focus on ninth grade success. And Lisa, maybe if you can break down how much of
Yeah.
that 250,000
Okay.
is the .4 and whether in
You bet.
signing up for the .4, is it, are we signing up for the full, the add-ons to that?
So the .4 is for ninth grade on-track coach. It's an additional FTE to make whole a ninth grade on-track coach at East High School for the purposes of coordinating weekly reporting systems to students who fall into the intensive category in the 9OT process.
So
On page
I'm-
33, I've got that at .2.
.2, and it says, and that's 16,000.
I have .2 here. The other pieces to this, just to clarify, so there's extended contract for ninth grade teachers for intervention. There's teacher teaming, which provides extended employment. There is PD, summer school credit recovery, the stipend. Here it is. There is another .2, it's broken out. It's about mentoring and tutoring, increased FTE at the high school to coordinate mentoring and tutoring responsibilities.
So
That's the other 2/10.
Could you help me understand why this needs to be an early?
Yeah, I think it's sort of what I said before, Mary. It's about stabilizing staffing plans earlier rather than later.
Okay, but with it being .2 and .2, it's not like going
Yeah.
out and hiring another person?
Right, it would probably be an ad or making someone whole or more part-time than they are right now. Yeah.
Any comments or on that?
Yeah, here's the footnote.
Yeah,
A
TJ.
general one, and I know that Kate put in a request, and I put in requests in previous years. In the context of this and making things whole in these conversations with these .2s and .4s and things like that, it would be really, really useful to know what staffing had been allocated to the schools at this point in the budget process, which we don't. And clearly, staffing has been allocated, but at this time, I couldn't tell you what it is. I can tell you a little bit about the formulas that were used. I can tell you what it was in January, but I can't put those pieces together. And I hope that before we approve the preliminary budget, if not the equity charts, we have some workbook-based version or some other version that allows us to do that.
Mike or Jen, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what we can do to provide that level of specificity for you, TJ. Do you have any thoughts on that, Mike? I don't know, I feel like we gotta think about that.
Yeah, we've, as we've said in the past, the staffing in a way is not that stable right now. So, but we obviously want to be responsive to the board's concern here. I think we can produce, well, let's give it a try to produce something. It just has to be heavily discounted.
Right.
Because at this time of year, it's out of date 2 weeks later, as principals make moves. That would be my caution. With that, With that understood, happy to produce what we have.
Just one other question, I just want to make sure that I'm reading this correctly. So then, when we're looking at this number 2, that's comprised of everything that's on page 33 and 34 in the budget handbook? Okay.
Right.
And then for the summer school credit recovery, is that pulled out now?
No, that there is still a stipend for credit recovery or non-promotion teachers.
Is that anything we need to go further?
That would be a need, yeah, if we wanted to put that in, well, let's think about that. If we wanted to start paying teachers that right away, it would be, I guess.
I was asking because we had the discussion about raising the hourly wage for summer school, so it seemed like that was
So-
redundant.
The note says unless, it's required unless it's being funded via the health care savings, which is a decision the board made. So it's essentially already funded, right? The item says funding from local is required unless it is funded via the health care plan savings. Having done that, this item, as of last Monday night, is really no longer necessary
Yeah, we
as a
can-
funding item.
We can check with HR about what the final communication is on that.
Is that also true, Mike, of the 500,000 for unallocated teaching positions?
Which is one of the final actions.
Right, because isn't that an early approval? Or have we?
No, there's no yes to that.
Yeah, I know.
Um,
That's why I'm asking how wouldn't we be?
It's, so the nature of that $500,000, maybe this, how we're using it will dictate the solution here. It is essentially a reserve of FTE, right? $500,000. It's one of the 3 final actions, right? That we previewed in April, and the idea is that that reserve would get translated into essentially teaching positions, and that we will use that between now and all the way through September to respond to class size sections that are drifting higher than we want. But the key there is actual enrollment.
But
And
how do
actual
you-
enrollment is tough to deal
So
with in
does that
May.
mean, but how do you respond if you don't have anyone hired?
So, on the other hand, we don't hire now, and then,
Yeah.
and then,
And then
I mean, the
allocate.
opposite of that is equally true. You can't hire in May, June in case it's needed. What happens if it's not needed? So, typically, we try to identify these situations in August and at the latest, early September. And the HR team keeps a short list of our next best hires. And that's how we fill those positions.
I get your point though, Mary, because the point of the unallocated reserve is not to hold on to it until after Third Friday. It is meant to be able to allocate on a rolling basis as needs are identified throughout the spring. And it's above and beyond the unallocated that we had originally built into the staffing plan, as you all know. So, I mean, it could, I mean, it's fair to wonder
I mean, I
about
can see
whether or
if you
not this
don't
should be an
know
early
where the
approval.
increase is needed, what type
Right.
of teacher, but we talk about early hiring and how important that is
Yeah.
to the quality and
Yeah.
and that it's hard to understand who we could hire in September.
Yeah. It's clear that we're a little rusty on this early approval process, guys. It's been a while.
Yeah.
But I think that,
Well,
I
it
actually
just
think
seems
this
we
could
had-
warrant.
It seems
I mean,
very board members
yeah.
have voiced
Yeah.
support
Yeah.
for being able
Yeah.
to address large class sizes.
I totally agree.
In the elementary
It's-
area.
If you can take care of it now, it's better than waiting until the
Not
fall.
saying where they will be allocated, but knowing that in fact we're ready to respond.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What are people thinking?
Would you support
Yeah.
that?
Yeah.
At least partially early approving on it. I mean, I think that I recognize that the August, September enrollments are going to create situations at a number of schools where classes that we had hoped would be in the 19 to 21 range are going to be in the 24, 25 range, and that the
always make
reserve
adjustments,
to reacting to that. But I also can see as we go into May and June, we can see that, those classes were at 22, and those are ones we really didn't want to have at 22. We wanted to have them at 19 or 18, and being a little more proactive. So I think at least a partial early approval, like a 3 to 2, kind of, 3,000, 2,000, 300,000, 200,000 kind of thing, would be something I'd certainly be comfortable with.
Yeah, I like that idea.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Fine. It's a
Okay,
different
that's
kind of
helpful.
priority action. It's not a priority action that requires immediate HR action tomorrow.
Right.
But it does sort of
It gives us
create a
flexibility.
certain
Yeah.
certainty in the budget, and that's fine. That's great.
Yep.
Okay, so I think with that, we're going to move on. I think what I've heard from board members, if I can summarize that, is with regards to the other items, is we're going to have to see how the whole budget shakes out, along with other proposals that board members may have to address concerns they have, along with what Lisa has mentioned or other things with regards to behavior.
Mm-hmm. Could you go to the timeline slide, Lisa or Mike? Since we're closing this conversation out, and I appreciate your feedback on the early approval items, and we'll follow up with additional information that you've requested. A reminder to the board that I wish we had more time to talk tonight, to be perfectly honest, because there's a lot more to discuss. And if you're feeling like me, you're wishing we had another hour to surface adjustments to the budget. But keep in mind that when it comes to the amendment process that we laid out, we'd love to get any additional questions. Some of you have already submitted some, thank you, or amendment ideas. By June 2nd is ideal. I mean, obviously, they can always roll in after that, but June 2nd gives us plenty of time to look at it, support you, get you what you need to finalize your amendment idea, to analyze it in time for the June 12th operations work group meeting. So please submit your questions, thoughts, ideas between now and then. And then at June 12th, we can go back through those ideas in detail. And as Lisa mentioned, we have, and this is just always the nature of things, after we've submitted our beautiful budget book, we realize that there's one or two things that we would like to adjust. And so getting back to her point about the behavior plan and some adjustments there, as well as advanced learner staffing, we'll get you those ideas in more solid form in advance of that June 12th meeting as well, so we can look at it all together. Anything else from you guys? Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that I kind of understand the process from here and make sure that you guys actually have what you need
Yeah.
from us. So, and make sure I understand. So I think we just gave guidance that we're sort of moving in the direction of the
early
launching the
approvals.
early approvals.
Mhm.
I just want to say out loud, that is between 1.5, so it's about a quarter of the pot of money that we have to play with.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on how the staffing reserve works, that would be up to $2 million-ish, which is about, it's half of the 4+ that we have available. So I just wanted to say that out loud, and then B, make sure you have what you need. Are we going to come back in June, I guess, and to the degree that we do want to take some of the other items off the table, replace them, change things, is that the conversation we're going to have in June, or do you need any of that from us earlier, I guess?
I think the sooner you can get us any thoughts, the better, always. I would not hold back on any feedback on the budget book at this point. But you won't have until June 12th to have a full board discussion on how everyone is feeling about those items. So, yeah, if you do have thoughts on things that you don't want to see on this list, do want to see on this list, knowing sooner would be certainly better for us. Yeah. Does that work for you, Mike?
That's right.
Okay.
And there's one extra step, and we realize the calendar's a little awkward. We wanted to offer, if you're really a budget enthusiast, kind of just a briefing, especially for our new board
Yeah.
members. The business office and HR will, through Barb, our talented administrative assistant, be happy to arrange about maybe a 2-hour kind of review. It has to be.
It doesn't have to be 2 hours. Up to 2 hours.
Or less. Or less. If you're not a real enthusiast, we can do an hour and a half or an hour. But the point is that we want to make ourselves available for that sort of less formal, more consultative opportunity to help board members get up to speed. And that actually goes for, even our veteran board members. If you got questions that are staff level, we want to set up an appointment structure.
Mary, can I add one more thing? It is occurring to me that we have a regular board meeting coming up on May 22nd, and typically we reserve our more in-depth budget conversations for the operations work group, but it's there, and we'll certainly be having that discussion and vote on the early approval list, which we'll put in, obviously, in your packet in advance of the vote. But if there are additional thoughts that you have, that would be a great opportunity to surface things that we should consider before June 12th. Okay.
There's one thing that came up last year with the amendment process that I'd like to have clear and everyone on the same page with.
Yeah.
And if it's not the page I'd like to be on, that's fine, but I just want to make sure we're on the same page. Came up last year, which was that after board members formally submitted amendments in advance, on the district website, and I believe attached to the agenda, the amendments related to adding positions or funding were shared publicly, but the amendments related to cuts were not. And I believe they both should be, if a board member offers in advance a formal amendment, that they should be attached to the agenda and perhaps posted on the district webpage. But if the rest of the board wants to make that distinction, I just want to be clear that distinction's been made and that it's a choice that's been made and not something that just happenstance. So that's...
Just a comment on that, TJ. I have to go back and kind of remember all the details from last year, but I think the major adjustment from this year compared to last year, and I think what led to some of that was that we used to require or suggest that a board member usually the amendments were about things that people wanted to add, not take away. I think they all were. But I may not be remembering that exactly right. But the amendments are generally about adding, and we had a requirement or suggestion that a board member had to make a suggestion about where to get the money from. And so those were generally the takeaways. And what we've removed from the process for this year, based on guidance from our board officers, is that kind of takeaway part. So you don't have to necessarily find a place to cut in the budget in order to support your amendment. It felt a little unfair in some ways. It was difficult for board members to identify the right place to cut. And based on that feedback, that adjustment has been made. If there is a straight up amendment to cut something, I think that should be on the list. But that is a nuance. But we can certainly discuss that with board officers as well.
Yeah, I think you talked about it earlier in the meeting, how historically we've been cutting positions. And this year, now we have the opportunity to add some. So I think one of the issues around the reason we didn't list some cuts was maybe because some of those were people. And we wanted to make sure that those people knew before we put it out in the public. So, so my small memory,
Thank you, James. You're absolutely right. Now my memory is it's coming back to me. Yeah, it was about people. Thank you.
For the new members, I'd like to share my perspective on making these decisions on all these different options. And I think the reason why it's really difficult to nail this down without looking at the entirety of the budget is we're always, I mean, no one's putting things forth that aren't good ideas, right? It all gets down to priorities, including the impact on the taxpayers of this community. And so until we see all of these pieces together and know, is this going to drive us over what we had said in the referendum would be the increase in levy. And so I think the best thing that board members can do is become familiar with the items so that when we do come down to those tough choices that have to put in place all of the different consequences, that we know what we're voting for. But it's almost impossible to have these votes ahead of time outside of the context of our own priorities, the district's priorities, the impact on the levy, et cetera. So I think we'll have to look as to that board meeting in May and whether really there's productive discussion to be had outside of that, or whether the time can be used for other things. Okay, so on to the BEP.
Thank you, Mary.
Yeah.
Four.
Okay, four it is.
I mean, it's been a long
Hey,
one
you
so
know,
far.
I
This one,
Oh, God. You're here. our staff to move quickly through the presentation. Everyone got this in advance. We've seen the data, so that we do have time for really good board discussion around this, and that we don't rush that. So
Yeah.
if Leah is rushing through it, that's because I asked her to rush through it. And we would love to keep the questions till the end. Unless there's something, we'll pause at some of the, where there's breaks, just to ask clarification type questions. Does that sound reasonable? Okay, good. Jen, you
All
want
right.
to lead it off?
Yeah, thank you, Mary. I'm just going to say a few things to open it up. And Leah is planning on zipping through the PowerPoint. As you know, we have been part of a national movement to disrupt what is often called the pipeline to prison. We want every student in our district to be academically challenged. We want them to be academically challenged in a safe and supportive environment. And we want to disrupt the historic patterns that result in a disproportionate number of our students being referred and receiving suspensions, specifically our African American students and our students with disabilities. For us, those things go hand in hand, safe and supportive environments and disrupting those historic patterns. Since we adopted our BEP 3 years ago, we've provided this quarterly update to the board. That's include progress on implementation, outcomes, action steps, and once a year we provide an annual summative report. That is something that you get in the fall. This is important, these quarterly reports, because we believe that this move to a more progressive approach to discipline, to restorative practice, requires diligent attention. We're not only trying to create new ways of working, it's very easy to fall into old patterns. So this diligent attention is really critical. Each spring at this time of year, right after our third quarter, we always provide the board with not only our typical implementation and outcomes report, but we recommend policy changes, and that's because we want to start the next school year strong. We've got to make sure that the copies of documents get copied and professional development happens so we can have a strong start to the beginning of the school year. So if you go to the next slide, I want to say just a little bit about outcomes. Leah will be presenting. She, as a reminder, especially to our new board members, is the Director of Student Physical, Mental, and Behavioral Health. We have 2 outcomes for tonight. The first is we want the board to understand where we stand in terms of implementation. Outcomes, action steps for third quarter, and action steps for the summer to set us up for a strong start to the school year. In terms of board action, we discussed this in the last little bit during the budget meeting. We want the board to pay close attention to possible budget implications so that we can finalize the budget in June. The second major outcome is that we need the board to discuss possible policy changes, which need to be adopted this month at the regular board meeting. So our agenda is going to be broken into 2 parts. The first will focus on third quarter implementation outcomes, our analysis, action steps, possible budget adjustments. That's where we'll pause for any clarifying questions after we get through the 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 bullets that are listed there. Then we'll go into the policy revision recommendations, which we do unfortunately need to go through one by one because they're very specific. There is a meeting being held for May 15th. As a follow-up to this meeting. We're hopeful that this discussion will help you understand where we are, help surface your thinking, but we'd like to use that May 15th meeting to solidify our thoughts. And hopefully that will include both budget as it relates to the BEP as well as the policy revisions. So May 22nd, the board will vote on the policy revisions. Early June at operations, we'll try to finalize everything we can as it relates to budget. Before I pass it off to Leah, a few final words. I want to reground the board in our guiding principles. These were established by the original ad hoc committee that James led, that was launched over 3 years ago now. They continue to keep us focused on establishing engaging learning environments that meet student needs. They keep us focused on explicit teaching of positive behavior, pairing consequences with intervention and support, and they remind us that exclusionary practice actually does not work, but it has a negative effect on students, especially students of color, and students with disabilities. And of course, it reminds us that family partnership is essential. We've been working on this for 3 years now. We've seen positive progress. For instance, better documentation, more attention to behavior response, more embracing of restorative practice, a reduction in exclusionary practice overall, but we have also seen our challenges, as you guys are well aware of, when it comes to consistent implementation of those practices over the last few years. Our 3-year evaluation will dive into everything that we've learned over these last 3 years. That is scheduled for our meeting in August. That is where we will talk about not only what we've learned, but where we think we need to go in the next 3 years. Tonight's meeting, we want to talk really explicitly about what we saw happen unexpectedly in our third quarter data, where we saw an increase, unexpected, of behaviors that led to suspensions. After a very thorough root cause analysis, we believe we understand what's happened, and we're pleased that we've already seen a significant positive turn of events, which we'll share with you as well. But the most important thing is we wanted to use what's happened and what we've learned in this last quarter to create some real urgency to drive for better outcomes in the future. So at this point, I'll go ahead and pass it off to Leah, and she will move quickly.
Thank you all. Thanks, Jen. I am so excited to be here tonight and eager to engage with you in discussions about implementation of the Behavior Education Plan. As is customary, whenever I present, we begin with an implementation update. Annually, we establish implementation outcomes and activities. In your materials, you have a comprehensive analysis of the activities that we engaged in during third quarter. This quarter, among many of our other accomplishments, we've gained some significant momentum in developing our pilot of DBT Steps A, which is an evidence-based intervention to teach adolescents effective regulation, decision-making, and problem-solving skills. And we're looking at piloting that intervention in our secondary schools, some work that Armando is leading. There are lots of other highlights related to implementation that you can take a look at, but I'm going to zoom us right into our quantitative data from third quarter. I just want to reinforce that the data that we are sharing tonight is through third quarter of this year, and the comparative years are also through third quarter. So we're comparing quarters 1, 2, and 3 from years past to this particular year. And I just want to point out that we still have 1 quarter remaining, and we will be reporting out again to the board once we have that comprehensive data analysis. Overall, there has been a decrease by 4% in behavior incidents as compared to last year, quarters 1 through 3. But unlike that mid data I showed in February, where suspension events were down slightly, our third quarter data showed an unexpected increase in the use in suspension events, with that increase really truly being driven with at third quarter. So those third quarter suspensions have pushed us unexpectedly higher than we had anticipated. One data point that we look at on a regular basis, as I alluded to in the key findings, is our behavior event data. So this quarter, or this year, quarters 1 through 3, we have had a 4% decrease in the number of behavior events. Another key indicator that we review when looking at our behavior data is our use of OSS. And at the conclusion of third quarter, elementary schools continued to help drive a decrease in the use of in-school suspension. Secondary schools, however, have had higher rates of out-of-school suspension through third quarter of this year. Disproportionality is represented on the screen both for incidents, behavior incidents on the left and suspensions on the right. In behavior events, we've improved disproportionality for our African American students by 2%, and OSS disproportionality for students with disabilities has improved considerably. So, as I've mentioned a couple of times, when we spoke in February for the Q2 review, out-of-school suspensions were down slightly. However, when we reviewed our Q3 data, it revealed a large increase in the use of out-of-school suspension just in Q3. And so, to better understand what was going on, we really looked at our monthly trends to understand our data trajectory. So we found very quickly that February and March demonstrated an unexpected use of OSS, a trajectory that we would not have anticipated as compared to years past. So because of that increased use of OSS, and the increased behavior incidents, ISS, et cetera, we chose to really dig in most deeply to our OSS data, since that is where kids are most pulled from their learning environment to better understand what was going on. So after we zoomed in on February and March and zoomed in further on our OSS data, we then zoomed in to try to understand which level, elementary, middle, or high, experience increases. At high school, suspensions were higher, but middle school ultimately was the outlier for us in out-of-school suspension data Q3. So the next level of data dissection that we engaged in, yes, you bet.
You got middle and high school were higher, but when you say outlier, oh, you mean other two? Okay.
Yes, thank you, James, for that clarification. Yep, great question. So we then knew that middle and secondary in particular were driving that increase. And so we then sought to better understand in which schools they were experiencing the greatest increases. So 5 schools, 3 middle, 2 high, demonstrated unexpectedly high rates of out-of-school suspension in February and March of this year, which accounted for approximately 50% of all suspensions across the district through Q3. While these schools have experienced this unexpected increase, they have also demonstrated an extreme willingness to dig in, to deeply understand their data, while immediately responding to mitigate for that increase, and ultimately immediately responding to enhance the school culture and climate within their environment to help students be set up for success. The last data set we dug into a little bit more deeply is student specific. So as you can see, we went from macro to micro. And what we really sought to understand here is who has been impacted by suspension. We want to be able to comprehensively support all our students, and to do so we have to be precise in identifying the range of needs experienced by individuals in our schools. So ultimately, the good news is that we know the students who are struggling with repeated behaviors, and we're supporting our schools to put comprehensive plans in place for these young people as individuals and the school as a whole. Similar to high school, we also have a deep understanding of our middle school students who are experiencing the most significant behavior challenges, again, so we can be more precise in our support. So once we had a better idea of our suspension data, where it was coming from, what types of behaviors it was attributed to, et cetera, we engaged in a deep analysis of root cause, particularly root cause of the increase of suspension, out-of-school suspension at the 5 target schools, or the 5 schools that experienced the largest increase. To understand the root cause, we chose to consult with Dr. David Osher. As some board members know, Dr. Osher was a consultant when we wrote the behavior education plan. He is a researcher at the American Institute of Research, and he has several areas of focus, two of which are very salient to our work around social emotional learning and school culture and climate. With regard to our third quarter data, Dr. Osher encouraged us to respond as if this is an emerging trend and act immediately. But he really encouraged us to recognize that we still have another quarter remaining in the school year. He also encouraged us to think a little bit about the impact of current political climate on our schools. We reached out to neighboring districts, and several experienced larger than usual increases in February and March as well. Additionally, we are noticing some correlation with the increasing unrest in our Madison community and the increased level of violence being experienced in our neighborhoods, having an impact potentially on our schools. So to deeply understand root cause, it required a comprehensive multidisciplinary team who are engaging with authentic data sources. So in addition to our team reviewing quantitative data, we also met with all secondary principals. We've spent time in our target schools observing and discussing factors that attribute to and impact the use of OSS. From that, we have identified several factors that we believe have contributed to our increase in OSS. On the screen, you'll see 8 root causes that we've identified. Some of our areas of challenge can be addressed immediately, such as the critical nature of teaching expected school behaviors, and others require a longer-term strategy as we prepare to launch for next year. I think I'll pause there and then take questions, Mary, if that's okay, and then we can do the action steps and implications.
Yeah.
Okay. Just looking at your root cause analysis, I would encourage you guys to go back and look. I have some real concerns looking at the data, and it's not addressed in the root cause, is that we see that in middle schools, it's a 1.69 average cumulative GPA. High school, it's 1.32. I would have to say one of the root cause has to be
Yes.
poor academic functioning that we need to be addressing.
I mean, that's why we pulled the data for you. I mean, we
I just didn't
absolutely
see it
agree
on
with
the
that.
root cause or it being mentioned, and I'm really concerned about, for kids that are academically struggling, how that then many times can lead to challenging behaviors in the classroom.
Yeah.
Or
Would agree.
disengagement, which we're seeing, I'm concerned with 9% of, well, I don't know.
And Anna, maybe I wasn't clear enough that our root cause analysis was really related to the spike more so than the overall events, overall students experiencing in school or out of school suspension. So I think that connect between academics and behavior is very clear to us and incredibly important to address.
Teacher?
Are there particular behavior events, behavior violations that are associated with the spike? Things, I mean, are kids doing different things or just more kids doing, or the same kids doing more of the same things? I guess did March and April look different, or February and March look different in terms of the kind of violations kids were having? And if so?
I would say not necessarily different. The same most prevalent behaviors were well represented this quarter. I think there was just more. So we saw inappropriate physical aggression that can sometimes lead to fighting, those physical behaviors. Being in the hallway and refusing to return to class was another large a behavior that contributed to a large amount of out-of-school suspensions.
And just to pause
Yes.
for a minute, that's a
Yep.
progressive behavior. So the first time that would be a level 2, and then the third or fourth time would have to be the third or fourth before it would be available for an out-of-school suspension, would it not, or is it only the second?
Second, with an intervention, it would progress to a level 3. Yes.
So
yeah.
and so in some sense later in the year we're going to expect to see more out-of-school suspensions simply because progressivity.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
That's
Mhm.
But I'm looking at the other year's data, it didn't happen the same.
Exactly, exactly. That is true, but we don't think that's the only part of the story. The other behavior, TJ, is those behaviors that happen in the classroom, that start in the classroom as disruptive and then escalate as students are less engaged.
Thank you.
Dean?
Yeah, the first root cause about restorative justice practices not being consistent. Do we know that in schools where it is being used consistently, that it's shown any difference than the schools that aren't using them consistently? Because we've had these practices long before we changed to BEP. So do we know anything about that?
So one of the data sources that we use in order to understand the application of the restorative approach is our climate data, and another data source that we use is our behavior education survey data. And so we are picking through right now the school-by-school behavior education plan survey data and really looking at beliefs and values and the efficacy of the restorative approach and comparing our schools that are our restorative approach target strand schools with those that are not. So our leading implementers as compared to those who are just dabbling or not yet implementing and are seeing incredibly promising and strong outcomes in terms of beliefs and values within a school community, that the restorative approach has a positive impact on student behavior. Just not fully codified in all environments yet.
Yeah.
Then why are there schools that are still behind in implementing these practices? What's the reason for that?
I think my personal bias would be that when we entered this restorative work, we entered it more as a response to misbehavior rather than a school, a strategy for ensuring positive school culture and climate that are responsive to student needs. And I'm glad I'm seeing teachers shaking their head because I'm reinforced.
I'm liking what she's saying too, yeah.
And so when we only use those restorative processes in response to misbehavior and as opposed to a school culture and climate that are characterized by restoration, we sometimes get ourselves into a little bit of a using the restorative as another way to like punish. So you've got to restore it with me as opposed to a community of let's restore it together. So I guess what I'm saying, Dean, is that when we only approach from misbehavior and not about the community and the beliefs and values and how we see kids, we're not able to make the biggest impact. So we're really trying to look at it from both culture and climate and the solving of problems.
So are we addressing that with professional development?
So we're going
Yes.
then.
Yes.
Yeah, we are going to go
Yes.
there.
That was
Yes.
good.
Yes, good.
Yes.
I was just going to add briefly, Dean, that I think another challenge, and we talked about this at our last teacher advisory group meeting, was about the fact that we've done quite a lot of professional development with key members of staff,
Yes.
like student support services, team members, but haven't done nearly what we need to do with teachers, right, with staff generally. And that's part of why we're recommending the approach that we're recommending.
Okay. All right. So let's dig in then to our action steps and implications. So using data to drive our action steps is critical, especially when we've experienced an unexpected increase in exclusionary practices. At this time, I would just like to encourage the board to reference the implementation document in your packet. The first half of that document really addresses the immediate action steps, many, if not all of which are already well in motion. And the second half of the document addresses our strategic actions and preparation for next year. So since reviewing our Q3 data, we are working really closely on the culture and climate in the subset of schools that we're referring to as target schools. while also engaging in strategic planning to ensure a strong start in the fall. We've taken some very concrete and very specific action steps, including our expectations of hallway supervision and hallway behavior, the use of cell phones, and the review of suspensions to ensure that we're both following policy and providing the least restrictive consequence we can for students. I really want to just reinforce how proud I am of our schools. They are working in high gear to do things differently fourth quarter. They're already creating the conditions and developing the climate necessary to teach and support positive behavior, authentically decreasing the number of out-of-school suspension events already. And I say authentically. They're digging in deeply to understand and implement the policy with fidelity while ensuring all suspensions are appropriate in line with policy. So we're not asking our schools to not follow policy, but we are asking them to think about the behavior education plan as a function of teaching and learning, and ensure that we have adequate supervision and support. So already, the application of these immediate action steps have made an impact in disrupting the trend in behavior that requires the use of OSS at both our target schools on the right-hand side and the district as a whole on the left. So this data for me really confirms that when schools and central office make a mutual commitment to dig in deeply and work together in the support of students, we can and will make an impact in very short order. Concurrent to the implementation of those action steps for fourth quarter, as I talked about, are the action steps necessary to prepare us for next school year, strategically addressing areas of concern and ensuring we launch next year with incredible strength. As a reminder, these are fully articulated in the document in your packet. And as we prepare, I want to just highlight, as we prepare for next year, I want to just highlight a couple of the things we're working on. We're working to really tighten the scope and sequence for professional development, especially for our deans and school security assistants, two groups that haven't had as much attention in professional development and have a huge role in implementing the plan. Additionally, we're supporting our students, to Dean's point, in the implementation of the restorative approach and the implementation of restorative in-school suspension. And we're also really working to plan and prepare for comprehensive intervention and progress monitoring and that documentation. And that is just imperative for us for next year. I am almost there, and then we will turn it back to you. One of the last things that I want to discuss as we transition to policy, or before we transition to the discussion, is potential budget implications under consideration in some key areas. Addressing the needs identified during our root cause analysis requires a close look at our resources. On the screen, you'll see several items that may require attention to budget. We are able to repurpose some internal resources to support emerging behavior education needs. Other items may require an addition to the budget, and we'll have some time tonight to discuss budget implementations, and then next week we'll talk in more depth about budget recommendations specifically. I do want to point out that we have made some considerable progress in fourth quarter with just intentional actions and concentration on specific high leverage action steps. So these have made a concerted impact in a very short period of time. And then the last thing I just want to talk about before I give Mary the floor to facilitate the discussion is just a foreshadow about what you will see in August. So this summer, we'll be finalizing our 3-year evaluation plan, and we will be finalizing our 3-year, we'll be finalizing our 3-year evaluation that we will share with you, and then developing and finalizing the implementation plan, the 3-year implementation plan that will complement that particular evaluation. So that concludes my implementation slides, and Mary, I'll give it to you.
So as Jen mentioned, we're planning on having another meeting next week because this subject is big, and we need to also spend probably a bit of time with the policy as policy changes, which we will do tonight. So the goal for the rest of tonight is to get on the table any questions you have about what Leah just went through, any things that were not talked about that we should be thinking about, particularly moving forward. And then staff can be in a position to really dig deeper into those and come back to us next week with recommendations or thoughts or feedback on any of those. And then we will jump in for a review of the policy changes to make sure we get on the table any concerns or suggestions that staff has, so that we're set to go through that and vote. TJ.
Thank you. And three things real quick. Number one is, not mentioned in the presentation, but the staff survey data showed real, if incremental progress in a number of areas, and I want to congratulate both you and your staff and our staff more generally in terms of the implementation, judged by those metrics, is moving in good directions.
Thank you, TJ.
Second, in terms of the possible budget implications, and I assume we're going to talk about those probably the 15th and not tonight, but I'd like you to, when you bring anything forward then, to bring it in the context of there's already $200,000 for welcoming schools as a priority item, and how do your priorities match on, is this more important to you than that kind of thing, and include that in there. So, and then the last thing is that in general, in terms of budget and other implementation pieces, the peace rooms, the planning rooms, and things like that are something that I would love to see concrete proposals, including budget lines around. So that's my budget talk.
Thank you.
Yeah, just some things around budgetary implications. This wasn't mentioned, but I do think there should be some consideration. I'm not sure where it fits in, but with our abeyance program, I do think there are some things that we need to revisit that may have some budget implications down the road. So I'm not sure where we would talk about that, but it's something I would like to have that discussion on. And then as well as just more information going into that discussion around the alternative programs. We were supposed to have a meeting on that, but that got canceled. It would really be helpful prior to making any decisions around budgets to get a rundown of our alternative education programs, what is in existence, what's being successful, what's not being successful. I really wouldn't support adding seats to an alternative program if we're not seeing success for our students in it.
Okay, Nikki?
Also, I'd like to see information on, I know the federal budget is talking about less payments for Medicare, Medicaid, and what we're going to do if those are cut and how they affect our programs, because we may not get the same amount of funding we're getting per individual student at the school.
Mm-hmm. Good points, good points. James?
So we're in like year 6 of this now, and I guess I'm always maybe a little different than the rest of the board. I'm always a little bit taken back because I think about year 6, and that's about where we are. Although it may be year 3 or something of the BEP, but we're actually about year 6. We've been doing PBIS for about 6 years, so I look at a 6-year time frame. And we come here and we get all this data. And sometimes I wonder if, we're doing the right thing. It's nice to see all this data, but it's a lot of data to comprehend. And so, and we can't lose perspective of what we're really trying to do here. That's educate kids. And Anna just mentioned the fact that a lot of the kids, a lot of our students that's having these issues are not achieving well in the classroom. One of the things we talked about very early on in the discussions around the BP was that, once we pull back on some of the discipline, what would that mean for the classrooms? Because if these kids are staying in the classrooms, what does that mean? And so are we seeing the effects of this in our classrooms? Because we're seeing that, as mentioned, some of these 1-point-something grade point averages. And so I wonder sometimes if we should just deal with questions. For example, how exactly are we going to fix these hallway issues? We've heard that we have kids roaming the hallways, and in fact, we know we do. And, we look at all this data, but I'm not so sure it answers the question for me, because going into September, I would like us to have this hallway situation fixed. And I hear us talking around the table, but I don't hear any solutions really. I hear, more implementation, and a lot of wordings on slides. But this is year 6, and we should not be sitting here talking about why we have people in the hallways. For me, I've said this for a couple of years now, maybe we should take baby steps. Maybe we should just say, okay, this year we're going to fix this hallway problem. Why do we have the kids in the hallways? Because they should be in the classroom. And if they don't want to be, if they're in school and they don't want to learn, then what are we going to do with that group of kids? And let's just make sure we define the problem correctly. We're not talking about some real large number of kids here. We're talking about a small number of kids that create problems over and over. We've seen the data on that, where we have certain groups of kids that create problems. This cell phone thing, it's a little crazy when you talk about it. How can we continue to have a cell phone problem for years? And so that has to be resolved, and we need to see some real solid action steps around kids sitting in the classroom on cell phones. I mean, these things need to be resolved, and on a personal level, I'd like to make sure we know what we're doing going into next semester in September. I don't know why no one talk about disrespecting teachers. All these folks around the table are always talking about teachers, but supporting teachers, but I don't hear anyone talking about all the things we hear about how students disrespect teachers in the classroom. Where is the information on that? How do I pull out of here what we're going to do about all the disrespect in the schoolhouses that we're hearing, how students address teachers? I would have never thought about that 20 years ago when I was in high school, maybe a little longer, but I would have never thought about that. People fight more than 1 or 2 times. How can you fight more than 1 or 2 times and still be in the school? Help me pull that out of all this data that you bring before us here. And, if the credit deficiencies are what's causing some of these issues, then how are we going to deal with that? And finally, family engagement. I've been talking about family engagement since I ran for the board 7 years ago. And it's still an issue as far as I'm concerned, because I think we need to deal with family engagement on the granular level. When we talk about community schools, for example, and all these big issues, we talk about how we engage families around those topics. But how do we engage a parent, for example, around the kid fighting in the school? I mean, where's the engagement there? What do that parent think about that? And so I want to see parent engagement more on the granular level. And so how do we tease that out of some of this data? And so maybe we need to flip this around, have questions, and then address the data to those questions, because when I look at in-school suspensions, okay, you have them going down, but it's been up for the most part. And I wonder sometimes if teachers just getting like, I'm tired of dealing with this problem, you go sit in the in-school suspension room. And I don't think that's what we want. And so, I just, somehow come September 1st, those are the things I'd like to see us have addressed in some very definitive way. And that's sort of where I am. And this is what I mean about the whole budget process. We have to get these problems fixed. And I don't know what it's going to cost, but somewhere between now and June, we have to answer those questions, because these things need addressing.
Okay. So maybe similar take a bit. I looking through the information here was struck that for me, suspensions has been the primary metric that we've used to evaluate our success. And for me, it doesn't tell the whole story. Suspensions is the last thing in a chain of events. And everything that happens before is about our climate in our schools, about the whether kids want to show up to school, if they want to be in the classroom or in the hallway. And so I would love to find a way to, I played with, actually, James, to your point, everything that happens before, and trying to understand it. 2/3 of our students that are kind of in this presentation, if you will, never get to suspensions, right? They're in a level 1 or 2. They're never getting past that. And so we've got a lot of students that we're working with, and I don't see quite the same level of attention from a kind of focus and just metrics perspective. Metrics tell us what's happening, but they also drive a lot of action. So I've gone into schools and seen groups of staff trying to figure out what to do about, how to suspend a kid, not to suspend a kid, but I want that same level of engagement on the level 1, right? On the student who just disrespected a teacher. So I don't know what that means, but I would love to find a way to focus a little bit more on, I don't know if it's prevention, but at least earlier in the cycle, and so yeah, and maybe there's some budgetary impacts there. Maybe it's simply how we understand and use the data. The maybe other thought to just throw over the fence in terms of budgetary implications. I'd love to experiment a little bit with just different ideas. I think I've certainly heard of several ideas that different schools have been using with some success, and would love to, and maybe even broader outside of the behavior world, experiment a little bit. And to me, it's not kind of, the budget ideas in here right now are very focused on behavior, right? Their student support, and one of the messages I've heard over the last couple of months is very much that it's not actually about behavior, right? Like, behavior is driven by other things. Behavior is driven whether people feel empowered at school, whether people feel like they're going to be successful at school. There's all this other stuff that we could be infusing resources into that would actually impact behavior. And so I would just have a very broad parameter around what could we experiment with. Could it be mentoring programs with high school students, sending them to elementary schools and paying them to be a teacher's aide, right? Like, that's giving children a role, et cetera, et cetera. Anyways, just take a broad view there around what anywhere in the cycle we believe might actually improve behavior, including truancy. So suspensions account for 1% of instructional days lost, 1%. So we got a lot of opportunity in a lot of other spaces for us to infuse resources to keep kids in the class. So those are just throw over the fence to you guys.
One thing that I'm pleased about is the teaching school resource officers on how to handle some discipline issues, because I think education is the key. I'm not speaking against EROs, I'm just saying education is necessary for student safety and teacher safety both. So I appreciate that. Other thing, James, I understand the issue of respect, and I believe teachers should be respected. I have a problem with codifying it and what constitutes respect. I don't want to create a ticky-tacky system in a way that says, well, one teacher considers certain things disrespectful, another teacher finds something else disrespectful. How do we codify it so that it doesn't end up creating more bias? That's what I'm worried.
Okay, I'm going to move on to policy, and we will have next week to continue on broader plans. So I think, again, we're not going to finalize the policy tonight, but we'd like to get on the table any issues. So again, these are things that have been identified by staff in terms of just updating our policy, making sure that heading into the school year, our staff have a clear idea about what is needed. So take it away, Leah.
Thank you. And I'm actually going to invite Dylan and Sharice up with me. Dylan, Pauly, and Sharice Perry are two members of our behavior education leadership team and have been critical leaders in the policy revision process. And so they are here for questions as we have them as well. Just really quickly, as you know, I know from years past, feedback is really important to making recommendations to adjustments to the behavior education policy. On the screen, you'll see a summary of those feedback opportunities, and in your packet, you will find a comprehensive summary of the feedback that we received from stakeholder groups organized by sections of policy. Additionally, in your packet, there's a comprehensive summary of policy change recommendations that we'll use to structure our conversation. There's 4 main changes you'll find, including minor adjustments to language to further infuse the document with the language we believe drives our decisions. You will find some modifications to level 3 and a recommendation that we consider adding 0 as an option for level 3, 0 days of suspension. Currently for 6 through 12, it's 1 to 3 days. There are also some adjustments in drug-related behaviors, sexual-related behaviors, and bullying-related behaviors that are somewhat more nuanced that we can talk about as need be. And then also, and lastly, is a recommendation that we actually do a reset in the progression of hallway behaviors, being in the hallway and refusing to return to class or not returning to class, that we actually do a restart of that at semester, particularly at secondary when we think about kids switching classes, that sort of thing. So I'm going to hand the discussion over to Mary, and she's going to work us through the policy change grid, both if there is something represented in that section and there are questions, but also if there are things that the board sees might be missing in terms of recommendations. We'd also really appreciate if you could flag those for us as well. So Mary, I will turn it to you.
The grid, I just want to make sure we're all looking at the same document.
Mm-hmm.
None of them are labeled as I see grid.
I apologize. So it says, it's got the little logo on top, and it says, please note proposed changes apply to both elementary and secondary behavior education plans unless otherwise specified.
Okay, so that document is actually the...
Summary document.
Summary, policy revision summary.
Great, okay.
Awesome.
So, because again, 6 pages of this, it's pretty clear what the changes are being recommended. Let's just go through. The first one is on page 1. This, I think it's the second.
You know, Mary, in
one.
Well, I just didn't pull it up.
Here, I think it's your second one. Policy revision summary final BELT suggestions.
And I put page numbers on every document except for this one,
Oh,
so my
okay.
apologies.
Mary?
Yeah.
In the interest of time, maybe we could just say, does anyone have anything they want to talk about on page 1, page 2,
Great, TJ,
page 3?
I would love that.
You know,
Okay.
and do it
Fantastic.
that
Great.
way.
Okay,
We're
I
getting
love
good
that.
at this, right?
Page 1. Does everyone have the document open now? Yep, good. Okay, page 1, that goes, has, okay, I'm just going to do it just like TJ said. Anything on page 1?
Print's pretty small.
These are basically changes to the, you can make it bigger, James. Okay, I know why they asked me to do the meeting here. Okay, yeah, these are basically language changes. Leah, can you tell us if there's anything substantive in terms of the policy changes
No,
here?
page 1 is all just adjustments to language to be more congruent with our approach to behavior.
Okay, hearing nothing, on to page 2.
Page 2, I would point you toward the very bottom of the page, around the bullying and harassment. And maybe Dylan or Sharice, if one of you guys. You want me to talk about logical consequences? So logical consequences, under responding to behavior, one of the changes is we talk a lot about logical consequences. We refer to logical consequences. We train on logical consequences, but we never actually refer to logical consequences anywhere in the BEP. So this is really just adjusting that so that we have more clear language that explains what we mean when we say that. And then another thing to note then that's more substantive towards the bottom is just an add in the bullying and harassment section. Dylan, do you mind speaking to that a little bit more?
So one of our recommendations, which sounds counterintuitive when we begin, but I think it does deserve some context, is similar to when we moved into the BEP. Gang behavior used to be a standalone behavior. But it didn't really describe what the behavior was. It really just described the association with other people. bullying and harassment is currently a standalone behavior that starts at level 2 behavior response and progresses to level 4 behavior response. But it doesn't really capture what the target behavior is. Was it a physical attack? Was it verbal harassment? Was it threatening behavior? And so we're having some disconnect between when behavior is coded, right, as bullying and harassment, that may start as a level 2, but it was actually a physical attack on a student that otherwise would start as a level 3 under the behavior education plan. And also, I think it's been creating this kind of disconnect between our expectations and obligations for investigating and documenting bullying and harassing behavior, and just coding it as bullying and harassing in OASIS and calling it a day. And so our recommendation here is not to investigate or document bullying and harassing behavior, but our recommendation is that it should not be a standalone OASIS code, and for the purposes of behavior coding, that the manifested behavior is what is coded, and that the bullying and harassment continues through our administrative follow-up and investigative protocol and procedures. So yeah, that's it.
So this is the first time in policy that this shows up, and then later on in the document, you'll see that there's a recommendation to actually strike the specific bullying category based on that recommendation.
Teacher.
I'm okay with this approach. I got one question with which Dylan raised, is that would it be possible to have an OASIS kind of a question? Should this be reported as should this go through the bullying process also? Because my concern is that I believe that for whatever reasons, our staff, parents, and students all underutilize the bullying reporting. And, you kind of go between climate surveys and actually what's reported, and there's a disconnect there. And bullying has serious, and harassment have serious consequences, emotional and other consequences for people. And so, can you assure us that will be done?
That is the intention, that even in the behavior write-up, there's kind of this little box of bullying, yes or no, because that also gives us the ability to cross-reference where we want it to be documented, which is in the bullying and harassment administrative follow-up forms. Because as we know, reported cases of bullying that are found not to be bullying are just as important to keep track of and to be aware of as founded cases of bullying, both from a legal perspective, but also from a relationship, quality of school experience basis. And OASIS doesn't capture that for us. So yes, that is our intent, to have a way to be able to at least indicate it in the behavior tab so we can do the adequate cross-referencing and have a holistic picture of what's happening in schools.
And would that holistic picture include sexual harassment and protected classes and et cetera, that level of?
Yes, and that is already in the OASIS system, is if you found that it's based on protected class status, there is a way to demarcate that now.
Thank you.
That might
Okay,
not be
so
the word
then
I wanted.
on to the,
This section around logical consequences, to me, it has an awkward flow. You move from logical consequences to respectful or disrespectful consequences. I'm not really sure what the intent is behind it, or where that, where did you pull this information from? Is this from like Love and Logic getting?
This is through, this is the language through developmental designs and responsive classrooms.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's just a little awkward. So anyways, I might look at it more closely. I don't have any changes for tonight, but it's.
Yeah, we can look at that.
Just one of the things I suggested in my briefing was that this and perhaps other material be moved to supporting documents, because the BEP is 70 pages long, and adding another half page or 2 or 3 is kind of, so just.
I would agree with PJ and John. My juvenile clients, the majority school offenses that I talked to them about, they've never read all 70 pages. They haven't gotten through them. If they were in separate documents, you might have a better chance.
Page 3.
On that point, do we rely totally on reading for them to get the information? Do we do any other kind of training or what have you?
Yes, absolutely. So we have required trainings for students that we provide modules and lessons that that schools implement at the start of the school year. And additionally, we have booster lessons that we encourage schools to use throughout the year, especially as they see their data shows practices that need adjustment or fine tuning. So yes. Okay. All right. So the next page gets us into the behavior response chart. So the grid and the dots in many respects, as we refer to it. There are a couple of things I just want to point out on this section. So one of them being that, as I mentioned in the summary slide, is that at response level 3, right now for grades 7 through 12, it is a required 1 to 3 day suspension, and we are recommending that we add 0 to 3 so that it is congruent with 6th grade all the way through 12th grade. That being one piece of the reason, but more importantly, we are hearing from our schools that they are really not wanting to have to employ a suspension for the first level 3 incident. This will require very, very careful monitoring on for our team in order to ensure we're not having disproportionate outcomes for our groups of students who typically experience more harsh consequences. So that's one piece. I will let Dylan or Charisse talk to us a little bit about the drug change. This is in response to board conversations in years past about weight and intent and how to best structure that part of the code.
Can we back to the ISS for a second?
Sure.
Yeah. This change will make comparing across years much more difficult because, and especially when we have a hyper awareness around suspension data.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want the rest of the board to understand this, that if schools are given the option not to suspend, perhaps it is a good option, but it's a new option. And at level 3, then they often will not. And that will give a different kind of playing field for where the data is being created.
Mm-hmm.
It's like moving the basket down to 9'5" or something. I mean, it's different.
Yep.
So.
So if I may, the focus, right, TJ, would be on the behavior incidents, looking at those different behaviors that would fall into those level 3 categories versus looking at OSS data to really determine what our interventions and supports would be. So it's focusing more on the incidents.
Mm-hmm. All right, Dylan, you want to talk to us a little bit about the drugs?
So the drug change is actually one that we took a year to kind of mull over some of the feedback that Ed and TJ gave last year when we removed the term intent to distribute. And if you'll recall, that conversation was really regarding how do you prove intent? And at that point, we were hesitant to put in a weight. And there are still the hitches in our get along with proving weight, although the abeyance program changes at, I shouldn't use that phrase. But, I think the abeyance program has also demonstrated, we've seen how many students are choosing to use the abeyance program. And the feedback we're getting from the schools is a kiddo with a joint for personal use, right, which is possession of drugs, because currently it is being under the influence or in possession of drugs, first time, level 2 behavior response, which is up to 1 day of in-school suspension. They said, but that feels very different than the kid who we have found with 8 dime bags of marijuana on him or her. We have no evidence that they sold it. We are not going to wait and set up a sting operation because, quite frankly, that situation also makes us and the board very uncomfortable. But to have evidence of a user versus something that seems much worse at level 2 just doesn't seem to make sense. And so we have landed on a weight, and our recommended weight is 1 gram. I will say, I did some Googling, both at like, what does it look like, quite frankly, because I just didn't have in my mind, like, what is 1 gram of marijuana, but also like, what are some of the criminal statutes? But I tend to be very hesitant to recommend that we write in criminal statute language into our BEP. Well, I think they should guide us and direct us in some ways. This is not the penal law. And so what we are recommending is not that if you have 1 gram that you're moving towards a recommendation for expulsion, but we are recommending to have a differentiated response approach when there are larger amounts of drugs. We did, let me just, I just want to say we did focus on marijuana.
Dylan, I just want to make sure people have questions before, that we pause there. And did that answer questions on that topic, Nikki?
It did answer, and I'm glad that we no longer have the definition of the intent to deliver on marijuana. I don't think it made sense, but Dylan and I have discussed that in past.
Past experiences, yes.
And several expulsion issues. And very, very simply, I'm glad that it's being done this way, because at least we have a concrete reason.
All right, and TJ, you're the one in the past who has brought this up. Is this addresses the concerns you have?
2 concerns. Number one is I think 1 gram is too small for marijuana.
Okay.
And number 2 is I think that other drugs should be 1 gram's just fine for other drugs. I mean, I think that's kind of that be it cocaine, heroin, LSD, something like that. Speed, 1 gram is a meaningful amount. Marijuana, 1 gram is not a truly meaningful amount. And so I would like to see a differentiation between drugs, and I would like the marijuana one to be higher. That would be my, and on the 15th, if there can be, if you can come up with an alternate and then we can choose between them, that'd be great. But yes, and thank you for the work on this.
We'll take that feedback. I want to be clear that part of the reason we focused on marijuana is that is our experience in our high school. We have not grappled, and perhaps we're not finding, but we have not grappled as a team with cocaine and heroin because that has not come to our table. So I just want to say that.
All right, so if we go to the next page, the behaviors around disruptive and uncooperative behaviors are a lot of language change shifts to be more congruent with our beliefs and values around behavior. And where I will, though, point your energy is at, well, actually, no, let me stop there. There's nothing terribly substantive on this particular page. So before I talk about the sexual behaviors, let's stop here.
Yeah.
I want to know more about this ad not following established safety plan.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Can you tell a little bit about what a safety plan is, what students typically have safety plans?
You bet. You want to take this one, Trace?
Sure. So this particular behavior response or proposed change, Anna, is due really to based upon some feedback we have received from schools. During our behavior education consults, we've met with all secondary schools and elementary schools, in which those consults talk both about regular education students and special education students. We actually craft safety plans for our, that's included in the IEP process, sometimes for students with disabilities, but safety safety plans are also crafted for regular education students who engage in behaviors that we believe are unsafe, and we want to make sure they're welcomed in the community, but we want to make sure that they understand appropriate school behavior. And so we have noticed that some of those safety plans that are carved out for that particular reason, for students to come back into our school communities, but to make sure they maintain level of safety in their behavior and expression, that the students may be actually violating their very own safety plans that were put into place. And so this particular behavior description wants to address that particular phenomenon that has typically, through this year, we've noticed, has been coded under the catch-all misconduct or serious misconduct. And because it's coded under that catch-all, we're not really able to, without going from one person to the next, pull that apart and really analyze that data. So this serves two purposes. One, to be very concrete and very clear as to our expectations that students will follow safety plans that are in place. And then two, to make sure that we have a strong collection of data in which we can analyze and then put forward specific supports.
So an example of that would be a student who has a safety plan requirement that he or she has their backpack searched in the morning when they get to school. So refusing to comply with that type of safety direction or that type of safety plan.
You might want to clarify that because
Yep.
my son has a safety plan and his would be walking out of the school building. He's supposed to come back. If he walks out and all of a sudden he's hit with a level 3 and then he walks out
Yep.
again, I mean, I think
Anna,
that's
as really
you
were asking that, I knew exactly where, exactly.
I mean, I would just be careful about that because you're really coding it at a level of like bringing drugs into the schools, weapons. I mean, we're talking about kids not cooperating with behavior intervention plans, so I would
So,
look at that.
and that, Anna, so that you know, was in our glossary. I don't know if it's included in the summary, but
It
it
is.
is included in the red line. So it's included here as to what type of safety plan we're referring to, which is why I wanted to start with that distinction.
Okay, teacher?
James raised two important issues, and there's two items on this page that speak to him. James talked about respect for our staff and respect for our teachers in particular, and he talked about this, notion that getting the handle of something, and the example he used was kids in the hallway. The first two items here, the second and the third items here, both change the language that would be related to those, and put in restarts so that the progressivity restarts at the semester level. And I guess when I met in the briefing, I liked the restarts a lot. But having listened to James and James's passion on these two particular matters, I guess I'd like to have a better understanding of how these changes would facilitate or hinder increasing respect for our staff, and decreasing kids wandering the hallways. And so both the language changes and the restart changes, and maybe this is something to kind of come back to on the 15th, but James did speak with a lot of passion on that, and I was listening, so kind of leave it at that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
All right, so then the next page is the last substantive page of the behavior response grid, and I am going to ask Dylan or Charisse to walk you through the three sexual behaviors, or the three sections that have sexual behaviors that we are proposing recommendations to change, as they are rather nuanced. So Dylan, do you want to do that one for me?
Yeah, I think this is again in response to ongoing discussions and feedback we've had on the BEP, both in a practical application of the language. What does each word mean? How are we distinguishing the current descriptions one from the other? And also on some learnings we've done over the year. There have been a couple of expulsions presented to the case with concerns about how we've defined certain terms. There have also been ongoing concerns regarding, and this is kind of where we move away from the penal statute, but what is consent? How are we clearly identifying to students what consent means? And so our recommendation is to streamline this so that there is less, we believe, ambiguity in the 3 described behaviors, and then to support that streamlined process through a very targeted definition of consent that relies on affirmative consent, ongoing consent, and express consent. Recognizing that we are balancing statutory definitions of a consent, which we did move away from given the age of our high school students, but recognizing that this is not about 2 teenagers who are kissing in the hallway, whether the law says they can or can't, but it is, by all outsider view, consensual versus sexual assault within a building. And so that is what we tried to both grapple with. What is and isn't allowed in our school. And you'll see in the definition of consent that it says, see above, even consensual sexual interactions are not appropriate or permitted in schools. So it's not that we're trying to encourage it, but it's a different behavior than non-consensual, and then providing a strong definition regarding consent. And so it is our hope that we are adding clarity to both students and staff, because I think they have been grappling with coding sexualized physical contact between students using our current language.
Okay, so there's both on that page and then in the glossary,
Yes.
those issues which Dylan has spoken about and clarifies.
Just one quick question. On the whole continued consent for the entire time, my issue is this. Does that mean someone consents, they could revoke consent? How are we going to prove that they revoked consent? It's not necessarily the easiest if there were no witnesses.
Quite frankly, these are never the easiest when there is no witnesses. And as...
Is this on? Yes, so I think that when we crafted this language, it wasn't really looking at what we can and cannot prove, but we were looking at it from the perspective of how do we protect and support both students who are involved in behavior that's not school appropriate, but make sure that, one, we reteach what we behavior expectations, and 2, that we support students in a way that they feel a part of this community. And so I think, Nikki, if I may, I don't think it was whether or not we can prove one person's story over the next, but trying to figure out kind of what clear directive can we give to our schools so that they can do their job in educating and supporting. And so I think that was the approach. But we do recommend any feedback. I mean, accept or welcome.
Appreciate
Thank you. Something. Give me a word. Give me a word.
It's late.
Okay, well, that wraps up at least session 1 on BEP. I would encourage board members, after reflecting on this evening, reflecting on the materials, to get to staff as soon as possible any other feedback, questions, topics, ideas that you'd like to have raised for next Monday.
And we'll have in Thursday's packet for Friday's public packet the any updates on the policy issues that we discussed tonight, as well as more specificity around potential budget implications. So thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for the feedback.
Thank
Helpful.
you, everyone. Motion, I will make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in
Everybody.
favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Meeting adjourned.